the workshop. Maybe some of you are involved in that. I'm just going to set a timer. Okay. Sorry that this slide is a little dull. The other ones will be brighter. So I want to say I'm excited to be at Syracuse because I think we're at a time now, or as I see it anyway, a time where we're sort of caught between an ongoing exploration of digital complexity and novelty on one hand, and then a desire for accessibility, clarity, concreteness on the other hand. So to tell you what I mean by that, we had a conference at Yale last weekend that Mario Carpo organized called Digital Postmodernities, and people like Elisa Andersek, Michael Hansmeyer were there talking about their work, developing ever greater intricacies and formal complexity on the one hand, and complex networks and agent-based communication on the other. So there's that side of things, but I think there's also this renewed interest that you're probably encountering with Jimenez, who's teaching here, and Angie Ko, which is really interested in figure and shape, and explicitly anthropomorphic figures, so figures with qualities like posture, like character, like gesture. Jeff Kipnis is doing work like this too, and he describes it as a close reading of character, or an attempt to harness the social, psychological power of buildings. In other words, trying to make them accessible and engaging to the general public in new ways. So I think Syracuse, so there's that, and then there's also the ongoing and exploding interest in objects and speculative realism, of which this I probably don't need to tell you much more if you're a regular at this lecture series. So I think Syracuse, in some ways, is, at least from the outside, a microcosm of this debate between digital complexity and an interest in networks of relationships and flow and infrastructure on the one hand, and then an interest in the nature of figures and objects on the other, discrete entities. So I think this is not really a true binary or dichotomy, and in fact it's the work that I'll show tries to combine the two in a certain way to elide this dichotomy. So we're trying to use computation and fabrication, which are interesting, I think, because the tools are continuing to evolve and open up new possibilities to produce environments that are engaging and immersive to the general public in new ways. So we're not, to give you something else to look at, trying to withdraw into discussions about technique, but really about how do we address the general public beyond the discipline. So I want to take a brief minute to frame this in a different way. Through the idea of, or Jacques Rancière's idea of the aesthetic regime of art. I don't know if you've encountered him at all. But I actually first read about him in Mark Linder's writing. And he talks about this idea of the aesthetic regime, which is very close to abstraction, very close. He uses the phrase, opening up a free play of appearances. So trying to disconnect the link between art and the meaning and hierarchies of what it's representing. So if you think about a trajectory from pre-Renaissance art through 20th century modern art, you could think about, this is something that Robert Irwin also writes about, and I'll just quote him briefly, the trajectory from when art was primarily about the supernatural, depicted the supernatural, to modernism when it's really about colors and materials much more generally. So the red robe of the King of Kings becomes in turn the red robe of a king, the red coat of a burgomaster, the red dress of the girl next door, a red cloth, and finally the color, the pure phenomenon of red. So that's Robert Irwin, but if you can imagine that, picture a painting representing characters from the Bible, and then later on mortal people, but people of high authority, and then everyday people, the girl next door, and then simply depicting objects, and finally depicting colors and the actual materiality of the paint. Each step in that sequence loses some of the meaning, loses some of the hierarchy with what's represented, until essentially it's up to the viewer to decide how to interpret the painting, what to imagine in the work of art. So Jacques Rancière has this idea of translation, which is when this free play erodes the differences between disciplines, between one medium and another. So he describes the way in which one type of performance can be shifted or translated into another. And so translation is a link between what one knows, what's familiar, and what one doesn't know. It's a way of producing something that's engaging, but also requires interpretation on the part of the viewer. And so that's a lot of what we'll be trying to argue with our work, that we're attempting to capture a kernel of the familiar within the new, within the novel. So we're trying to combine accessibility with complexity, produce spaces that are both engaging and also challenging in new ways. So I'll try to talk about that idea in the projects in three ways, or three scales. One is through the visual, through iconography and pattern. Another is through medium, through the translation of two-dimensional and three-dimensional, drawing in space. And then the third is in terms of scale, how to think about expressing both the scale of the entire building, but also the scale of rooms and a kind of cellular scale of architecture. So the first one, the visual. I want to make one more brief theory reference, which is an essay. These are three paintings maybe one painting by Bridget Riley, who was an an optical artist. And David Hickey's an art critic and wrote a great essay, a very short essay on op art called Trying to See What We Can Never Know. And the thing about op art is that it's immediately accessible. We can see the depth, we can see the movement in these paintings, even if we've never heard of Bridget Riley, even if we know nothing about op art or art in general. So op art, Hickey says, tests the limits of our conscious perception. We have a physiological reaction to these paintings. They're immediately accessible, that we almost have an automatic response to them. And so it's a way for Hickey to get to our unconscious selves, our subconscious selves. So all the ways in which we respond automatically, we involuntarily process and perceive. We do some of those things in response to optical art. And that's in contrast to another way of thinking about art, which is what he describes as the artist's hand narrative. In other words, what was the life of the artist like? What period were they working in? All the facts and ways in which, or knowledge that we need to know in order to read the art. That's very different. That's much less accessible than these properties of op art, which are so immediate and so clear. So op art, one more time for Hickey, is a way to connect the known, the painting right in front of us, with the unknown, this automatic responsive self or subconscious self that we have. So we're less focused on Bridget Riley, but we really enjoy this artist who's named Carlos Cruz Diaz. And I just want to show, so rather than using the two-dimensional to suggest depth and three-dimensionality, what he's doing is actually using a little bit of relief. He's building up layers, including putting aluminum strips in the painting. So I just want to show a really brief video. About 30 seconds. That one. Just so you can get an idea of what these are like up close. So you can see the aluminum strips that are in the painting itself. So as you move around from side to side, the appearance of the painting really changes dramatically. There's different reflections, and then different colors are hidden by the strips in depth. Okay, so the first project is a project we did for the Possible Mediums exhibition, which just came down at Michigan, but is an exhibition and conference which Kyle curated in collaboration with 3 of his colleagues. And so what we've been quite interested in complex, intricate, three-dimensional structures for a while, and we started looking at these box kites that Alexander Graham Bell produced, and this was pre-Wright brothers. This was his idea of how we could fly, and in fact, with thousands of little V-shaped wings stacked up in the volume, and in fact, it did fly, even if only for a minute. But so we were less focused on flight, but more interested in the spatiality within the matrix. And so we took a simple cubic volume, split it up into these cells, gave each cell a center point, and then designed these surfaces to converge at those center points. So there are all these sort of nested hierarchies of scale within the cube. This is about a 4 foot by 4 foot cubic volume with 26 different cells within it. Now the issue there is that every joint is unique. All of the angles are unique, but frankly today that's less of an issue. We were able to, with Grasshopper, just to output and 3D print all of these connections, and so a series of rods plug in to the center of these cells, and you get, as I said, 26 of these cells. They were surfaced in order to imply and create volume, and then, as I said, we were interested in how visually to translate some image that was known into something that was unknown. So there's nothing more recognizable than the human face. And this painting is a painting by Marilyn Minter, who does these incredible paintings of glamour, sort of the other side, the far side of glamour. So there are, in this case, an eye covered with layers of makeup, and so we were really interested in the color and the visual effects that get layered on top of this very recognizable feature, being the eye. And so we mapped 2 of these paintings onto the cube, the kite, 3-dimensionally. So we're projecting them through the object, printing out these surfaces with those colors mapped on. And then you get these, this is some portion of the 26 cells, which just stack up together. They get zip tied together, but produce this 4-foot cube. And so it has all of these layered volumes on the interior. But then it's also has this very barely recognizable image. The eye is kind of right there. I think the image is not particularly recognizable, but there's a consistency to the set of colors and tones that are projected that slowly dissolves as the kite rotates away toward this other side. And I'll just skip out one more time and show this video, which is just the kite in motion. So the other side is sort of coming around right there. And so it looks fairly haphazard and random, but in fact it's very highly ordered. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of symmetry in both the section and the plan. We try to, I'm going to show a series of installations and pavilion scale projects, but we work hard to try to deploy some related ideas in the world in general. So we've done a series of commercial interior projects in Los Angeles. This one is a deli in Culver City. And so it's a very simple shotgun space where essentially you order, you come in the front, you order, you move back through the space to seating which is outside. The health department did not allow us to have any seating indoors. So essentially the design is a way to produce this rhythm of differently scaled spaces as you move from front to back, primarily through the ceiling. So you can see that here. We started with this space with nothing in it except for one skylight. And so we exaggerated that. We pulled that down in the ceiling and then replicated it with two more of what we're calling light scoops. This is a contour drawing of those, just with fluorescent lights. But you can see how open the space was until we added these ceiling elements, which torque and twist to meet the walls on one side, and the other side has these slats which contain lighting behind. So these scoops really hang over you. They're pretty large. They're very large, and they are very present in the space. And then you can see the baffles, the slats with the fluorescent lighting behind. And so the other element of the project was this west wall, which you can see here. And the clients were great, very open-minded, but this was an artisanal deli. They were thinking about the natural qualities of the food. They were interested in a kind of picturesque or pastoral idea of landscape associated with the space. And so they kept bringing in these images of the Alps and alpine meadows and picnics. And so we were less interested, or we were not interested in trying to produce a sort of nostalgia for nature in the space, but what we did was took this image of the Alps at the top and translated it through a digital pixelization or digital bits into a grid pattern that's more and less dense. And so this pattern is stretched across the entire length of the shop, from the front door to the back. And so you never can stand back far enough to see the whole thing. You're always sort of immersed in it and in the midst of it. So I think you would never understand it as the Alps, but the idea is that it has some element of that sort of contour. Maybe if I of that sort of undulating contour, but opens up a far bigger range of associations. It has a little bit of that free play of associations that I was describing at the beginning. One other commercial project which is related is an Italian restaurant in Los Angeles. This was a pretty dynamic space that we had to work with, a triangular space between two streets. But all we could really, our primary scope of work was two walls, this red one on the left and then this porous baffled soffit on the right. We did the bar and this communal table, but most of our work was in these two surfaces and trying to get those two surfaces to imbue the entire space with a unique identity and a kind of intense atmosphere. So this first wall is somewhat similar to the mural in the last project in the sense that we took something that the owner of or the client was interested in, which was pasta, and tried to treat it abstractly enough and filter it through a kind of computational process such that you would not think immediately of spaghetti, but that you would see the varying rhythms from the top of the space where it's quite even, a kind of striping, to the middle where it's much more varied in its alternation between just red and white, to the bottom here where it sort of nestles up onto the back of the banquette. So you're never far enough away, or this is at such a scale that you're always sort of immersed in it. You're less trying to decipher it as an image and more just as a texture and an atmosphere. The other surface, the green soffit, is where a lot of the lighting for the space is coming from. And here we had more three-dimensional depth to work with. And so what it is a series of baffles which are rotated in plan, sort of at different angles, so that they are more or less porous, more or less open, depending on where you're standing. And then this pattern of faceted triangulation is cut away from the backside of the baffles, getting you this result. And so this is actually the back, this is the front. A lot of people have said, why didn't you put this on the front? It's much better. And you never actually see that side of it. But what we were interested in was the subtle shifts of light and shadow that come through on the front side from the back. And the reason is that as you move through the space, as you change your orientation to this elevated soffit, what you see, the pattern of light and shadow that you see subtly changes, very much like that Carlos Cruz Diaz painting. So if you're exactly perpendicular to it, you'll see this, but it'll slowly shift as you move through the space. And the idea is that this isn't just something to look at, but it's having an effect on the entire space of the restaurant. It's polarizing or differentiating the space at a much bigger scale beyond itself. It comes out over you as you go out the back door, and it imbues the whole space with some pretty intense color. Okay, so that was the visual scale of things. I want to show 3 projects which deal with a translation between mediums, between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, between drawing and space. And these were some early projects that we did that were looking at or attempting to design patterns that would have very general, very vague associations. So they were not translations of an image, but they were simple types of structure, or types of patterns, structure, nature, and bank. We were looking at Louis Sullivan's bank buildings in the Midwest, but the idea was that this implies hierarchy and ornament. And extruding those patterns through a cube, either linearly or in a distorted way, and looking at what the resulting thick wall or surface was. And so we did that for a number of, in a number of ways, but the idea is that less that anything would be recognizable in these patterns, but more that they just have this consistency, which whether you're looking sort of more straight on with them or obliquely remains consistent. So we also think about pattern as a way to preserve a kind of identity or establish an identity for our office in general. So each of these projects I'm showing has a pattern like this, and I think there's a rigor that extends from one project through another project, partly because of these drawings. And there's also an organizational consistency to this type of pattern, which can incorporate a lot of difference. So it's not a subtly modulated field of variation. There's really significant differences here, but there's still a kind of consistency, whether it's in the triangulation or the depth or the thickness of each line, that kind of thing. So I'll show 3 projects where we think about pattern in a similar way and the extrusion of pattern in space. This is a pavilion that was we submitted as a competition entry about 5 years ago for competition in the UK. And the competition involved this company called Facet, which was a CNC fabricator of this building assembly system, this series of what they called cassettes, which stack up and produce a building. Now, I think this is a fairly efficient way to make these, but the cassettes are all identical. And one of the very basic tenets of digital fabrication is that you can make many different elements at the same cost and in the same time as you can make many of the same elements. So it seemed obvious to us that we could make the same type of cassettes, but in many different ways that would work as both stack up and work as wall, or work as ceiling and roof. And so it's a single pattern which is extruded through. And so we started with a simple triangulated pattern which went from dense to sparse, from very small elements to much larger. And that gets extruded through 3 different surfaces, each of those with a different set of alignments and constraints. So for instance, this wall folds at a certain point. This one has a door. This one has stairs. And so the pattern itself has to adapt to each of those alignments and scales. And then when it's extruded through, it's a kind of almost a semi-solid mass that we very much wanted you to feel like you were within that sort of matrix of continuous surfaces that make up the 3 walls. So this is that structure. You can move up onto the roof here, through the pavilion there, or into this gallery and classroom space there. So this is the passageway through with the classroom to the right, which, so on this one side we were expressing these cassette elements, trimming them with a single smooth surface, and on the other side allowing them to stack up as individual planar faced elements, very much more like a tectonic stacking system. And so we did not win that, but we were able to build a small kind of mock-up or part of the structure in a gallery, the Woodbury University West Hollywood Gallery in LA. And so on one side, again, we were trimming all of these edges with a single smooth surface, and on the other expressing each individual one as a stack. The joinery and Everything was done with notching, including one unit notching into the neighboring unit. This is the inside of that passageway. So a very related project was one that I did with a seminar of students at Yale. And the idea was closely related, that we would take a two-dimensional pattern, which had a certain logic to it, a triangulated logic, and extrude it through and produce this, in this case, a three-sided structure with a roof that sat on it that would be very porous in this one direction. And so we spent a lot of time developing, or some time developing, a two-dimensional pattern that would structurally perform, but had some dynamism and flow to it. We worked with ARC in New York to evaluate the structural performance of where did we need more density of surfaces, of triangles and surfaces, and where did we have enough. And we looked at it visually. We were painting the inner portion of each of these surfaces red or orange, and looking at how that red or orange could emerge to the surface as you moved around the structure. This is the sort of unfolded interior elevation that we got. This project, we were not working with wood, but with aluminum, which is a foldable material that we could cut in the shop. All of this was done in the shop at Yale. So it was plasma cut and then painted, and then folded up along these lines, just like corrugated cardboard, so with a kind of zigzagging back and forth between horizontal layers. Everything was notched together and then riveted tight. And the scale of this for a student project was huge. It was 14 feet tall in some places, and very, very lightweight for the scale because it was just folded quite thin aluminum. But this is in the loading dock of the school. These pieces we were calling bricks. They were loaded into a truck and brought to the site, and then assembled next to each other and riveted together. This is the pavilion. I should say this is the program for this was the information center and headquarters for a performing arts festival that happens on the Green in New Haven every June. So this is they have music, performances, etc. And so this is the interior. And it was not this is the triangulated pattern that we were extruding, but we were not extruding it in a linear way, but in a distorted perspectival way. So all of these surfaces align toward a single point out in the field, in the lawn near the pavilion. And so the idea there was that as you moved around the structure, it would open itself up and become more porous until when you got to that point, suddenly the entire thing would nearly disappear. It would be entirely see-through because all of those folded surfaces were aligned with where you're sitting or standing. And so our interest was in having this object have a relationship with its surroundings, be able to not just stand there as an object, but transform the area around it in some way. There's a sort of cliche or trope that car designers will often take a car out to the desert so that they can see the horizon line reflected in the curving surfaces of the body of the car. So that line will sort of move around as you move around the car. And so our interest was in trying to make this lawn all around the pavilion a bit like the surface of that car, to differentiate it, to, in a sense, pull you through space toward this point. So the pavilion's porous and open in some places and much more opaque in others, but as you move around, you come to this point where the entire thing is fairly close to invisible, because all of those surfaces are aligning. And then from the interior, there's also a kind of vector that leads you toward the stage, with all of these surfaces moving or pointing in the same direction. Last project like this is an installation in a gallery in New York, which is also an extruded project, and we were thinking about egg crate structures. Egg crate structures are just an extruded grid, but what's great about them is that they allow you to produce this curving implied surface just through the trimming of the edge of all of these linear surfaces, all of these planar members. The problem with them is that there's nothing more static than an orthogonal grid. It's always the same. It gives you the same datum for registering that curvature, and so we were trying to think about whether we could engineer an egg crate structure where the grid, the members and the orientation of the members themselves would have as much dynamism and variability as the curvature of the surface. So we came across this Lebbeus Woods drawing, which he put on his blog in about 2010. He was calling it slipstreaming studies. So just hand drawings of flow. But we were seeing certain areas where we could imagine a set of elements moving in one direction and a set of elements moving in a cross direction that could notch together much like an egg crate structure, but still imply flow and dynamism rather than static sameness and consistency. And that's really what it is. There's one set of elements moving in one direction, another in another, and sometimes these intersect and notch through each other. But that's fine, that they just do that, and then they notch through the other direction. So each of these notches is a slightly different width. When it's 90 degrees, it's very thin. When it's a more acute angle, it's wider. But again, that's something that is pretty easy to account for these days with something like Grasshopper. So we were able to calculate those notches automatically and lay them flat and cut all these pieces fairly easily. The other thing that we were interested in was presenting this structure at the kind of front window of the gallery, very much as a drawing. But then as it gets extruded and trimmed away, it takes on this other character of speeding up and slowing down, depending on how it snakes back through the space, how it interacts with, how the plan profile interacts with the extruded pattern. And so this is all those pieces in the truck to the gallery. This was another thing that we made in the CNC shop, cut from plywood and then painted in the shop at Yale. And so this is how the installation presents itself as a drawing in the storefront window. A little bit of depth, but pretty much just a pattern of lines. And then how it moves through space and makes a series of spaces moving back into the gallery. And so you can see the sort of tectonic quality of how things notch through each other and how at times it's very much like a series of lines in that Lebbeus Woods drawing. And how when you're standing in the gallery looking laterally, so if the project is moving, zigzagging back and forth, or you're looking across the space, it's very opaque. It's entirely opaque. You don't see through, but when you're at the end, say standing on the sidewalk looking in that window, everything is aligned, so you see all the way through to the back of the gallery. And this is where that three-dimensional structure kind of meets with the 2.5D drawing in that window. I want to talk a little bit about drawing. Each of these three started with a digital drawing that then was developed into a three-dimensional structure. And often we'll go back and look at the drawing again and try to develop the drawing and produce some of the same qualities that we found in the structure in the drawing. So I have a colleague at Yale named Turner Brooks who we were on a review once, and he said he had never seen a digital drawing that had as much character as a good hand drawing. And so we did these drawings partly based on that comment, trying to get a digital drawing to have some of the effects of a different medium, of hand drawing, of painting, etc. So this first one is just that same pattern that we used for the installation, but much denser, more lines. And then we were trying to think about charcoal drawing and erasure and how we could produce some of those effects through a digital print. Similarly, this one looks at the same set of lines, but a more painterly gradient transparency and overlay of strokes. And then some others which are more tectonic, more about articulating each element as a thick piece. We also did some large drawings for the Kite, the first project I showed. And as I said, these were intended to show, because the Kite looks quite chaotic and even random as it rotates, to show how ordered it was, how much repetition and symmetry there was, and also to suggest some of the depth and volume on the interior. So this drawing is entirely made out of lines, and those lines converge, and so you get more darkness and kind of shadow at the center where they do converge. We did 2 plan cuts and 2 section cuts. And we also did a couple of drawings which were about 4 feet square, where we were interested in some of the other effects of what we thought the structure produced. So this one is a series of colored vectors out from the centers of each of the 26 cells. And then this one takes that image that we were projecting through, and only through line work overlays that on just the surfaces of the Kite. And we also did a series of drawings for this project, which was in a gallery in Vienna. And really the structure was about literal and phenomenal form. In other words, that structure curves, but it also has a pattern which implies curvature even when there is no curvature. So there's a series of lines and points of focus, even on a flat plane, which suggests folds and points of density. And we did a series of very large drawings to extend that study, to make use of the visual density of the structure and the pattern. Just a plan where, again, you can see some of the implied creases and points of focus. A bottom view. And then this drawing, which was about 9 feet tall and 7 feet wide, and took the different layers of that structure and kind of unfolded them and overlaid them all together. And the idea was same stuff about pattern, but also for this drawing to work at a series of different scales. So when you stood back from it, this is what you saw, but as you zoom in, we were adding all of this information about every single, this is a low-res image, but every single corner point gets a little coordinate. There's a series of dashed lines about the undeformed triangulation of the structure. And the idea was not to give you enough information to recreate it or something. It was to layer in information and visual and graphic effect, even when you got up close to this really huge drawing. Okay, so last set of projects. And I said that the last category was about scale, about thinking of buildings as aggregations of room-sized volumes. In other words, expressing the scale of the entire building, but also the scale of the individual spaces within it. And therefore producing this link between the large and the small, and suggesting that the building is a series of very distinct environments that are all interconnected in some way. So it's both continuous and discrete. And so we've spent some time looking at complexity and contradiction, the Robert Venturi book. These are 3 plans he reproduced in the chapter 9, called Inside and the Outside, where he's looking at all of the different overlaid hierarchies and figures within the plan. This is St. Basil's Church in Moscow, which is particularly fascinating because it has all of these isolated chapels, which are around the periphery. They're not at the center. And so you're moving through the space in between. In any case, we were and are interested in some of those things, but very much in 3 dimensions. And so we've also been looking at the work of Peter Pierce, who wrote this book, Structure in Nature is a Strategy for Design, in 1980. And it's essentially a catalog of polyhedral space-filling aggregations. So if you take a 14-sided object that can stack up and fill a volume, or looking at 2 different objects that nest together and stack up to fill a volume. This one's he's very interested in nature, but I think it's a pretty interesting catalog of interlocking 3-dimensional form. And he actually did some amazing structures as well. But there was a sort of purity. Everything is modular. Everything is the same element repeated over and over again. And this, I was on reviews at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn one day, and in the basement are these display cases with all of these student models, I think made in a similar time. And so maybe like op art, I think there was this period where people were really interested in space-filling modular structures. And I guess the question in terms of why to return to this is that I think we have much more control over these now. We can produce these digitally and therefore distort and change them so that they're a much more supple, malleable, and adaptable system, potentially. And so we've done a series of projects that try to think about geometry in a related way. This is another competition entry for a building in Istanbul. And Istanbul has a very low quality of building generally, and they're expecting an earthquake. And so, this competition was for a disaster prevention and information center. And so it's both a conference hall, but also this sort of strange infotainment center for adults who have a very dark sense of humor, I think. It's a series of rooms where they'll simulate a forest fire, or a really severe rainstorm, or there's a smoke room, there's an earthquake simulator. And so what you do is, what there are is a series of these very hermetic spaces with really intense atmospheres, full of smoke, full of water, mist, heat. And then around each of those rooms, you need a ton of ventilation and plumbing, a bunch of pochets to handle what's happening on the interior. And so that's essentially what we set up, was a series of these core exhibition rooms with a ring or donut of pochet systems around them. Some of those then stack up and stack on neighboring ones to produce a lobby below. We looked at how to get light down in between, and then how to passively ventilate. And so in the section, this is the lobby, and then you move up and walk from room to room on the second level. we were looking at how to nest these objects together in an intricate way. And we started working with five-sided shapes, with pentagons or near pentagons, because pentagons don't repeat evenly. If you take a square, obviously, or a hexagon, a hexagonal grid will repeat endlessly. A five-sided shape won't do that. Anyway, a pentagon won't do that anyway. So these were studies of how we could nest up these objects next to each other while allowing a gap for light and ventilation to get down in between. So here are a series of the colored objects are the core exhibition rooms, and then they slip inside these poché donuts, and they nest together. We had to figure out how, not just to let light between, but how to allow you to pass from one into the next, so they overlap in a lot of places. This is the ground floor plan. You come around and get dropped off here. There's a lobby for the conference center here, and then a lobby for the infotainment museum there. The lobby underneath. The skin of the building is this quite large-scale tiling, which breaks down into triangles that repeat or suggest faceting or folding even when there is none. So this is a four-sided surface, plane, but it kind of looks like it's folded, and so we were trying to produce some visual ambiguity in the forms. The drop-off with the lobby behind. This is the lobby of the conference room, and so it's a quite neutral volume, but because there's so much intensity going on in the rooms themselves, so much color, so much moisture in some cases, so much heat, that we were interested in how that would infuse the lobby space, the more neutral lobby space, with a series of very different atmospheric qualities. Second floor plan, where you move around in the poché from room to room. We were thinking of the Olympic rings a bit as a diagram, where you would move around not to the center, but always around the edge of these boulders or units. And then that space where you're kind of moving around the core rooms. One other building that's a similar scale, and where we're looking at these three-dimensionally packed polyhedral volumes in a maybe more densely packed way, is a library in Korea. And so this is a much more of an infill site. It's bounded, had a very clear boundary. And our interest was in trying to combine the size of the building with the size of the sort of nooks and crannies, the rooms that were more appropriate for reading or surfing the web, that there's a sort of intimacy that's expressed as well as the institution of the library itself. So that's this drawing that you sort of would get this aggregation of distinct spaces. On the ground floor is this open media common. I think the programmatic questions of libraries now are pretty well, you're probably fairly familiar with them, so I won't discuss that. Going back to thinking about the Seattle Library, for instance, what do you do if people are not checking out very many books? But so above that level are a series of these reading, book carol, and community meeting room spaces. And again, we were looking at five-sided cells in the plan, but shifting and rotating each layer as you moved up. Each of the 3 floors gets rotated. And so you get a series of vertical structural cores where elevators are, and then atria, voids within the floor plate. And these because of that rotation, are vertical some places, but diagonal and stacked and stepping in other places. So you have a series of these volumes that get packed up and nested into the 3 floor plans with this series of voids cut down through the 3 levels. And so here, looking at the ground floor, looking up, as you step back at each level, moving up, this is one of those voids which becomes the entry to the building. And because of that stepping, there are these spaces that are sort of between floors, overlooking the lower floor, but below the upper floor, again, here as well. And these pretty dramatic variations in the height of the ceiling. And then the top floor. I'll end with two houses, one of which we're just finishing CDs for. The first one is a house in the woods in Maine, just outside of Portland, Maine. It's about a mile from the ocean in this pretty dense pine forest on a hill. So you potentially could have a view of the ocean, which the client was really interested in, but we were also wanted to preserve the density of the forest, and actually pretty fascinated by that, by the rhythm of shadow and sunlight, solid and void, that you get moving through the forest. And this is Maine. This is an area where a lot of people hunt, and including hunt deer. And one of the ways that you hunt deer is you build a deer stand, a platform in a tree or between trees, and you sit up there and you wait for a deer to go by. So we thought about deer stands as a way to describe this variable density between solid and void alternation of the forest. And we did this sort of, we imagined a set of deer stands that would be proliferated throughout the entire forest. Every single tree would get a deer stand between the trunks of the tree. So you'd have these voids, but then platform, void, platform. And we tried to imagine how our house would sort of fit into this alternating solid and void field. The other thing that we wanted to do was create this view to the ocean, but try to minimize the number of trees we were cutting. And because it's a slope, sloping down, these are the contour lines down this way, you approach the site from above. So the house is essentially a wedge, which you look over. It's the foreground for your view out to the ocean. So these are just studies of view to the ocean and to the city of Portland, blocked by each tree, and how we would have to trim or we would have to clear this wedge of the forest. So this is the building. It's a series of 6 interior volumes which alternate with 4 courtyards, 4 exterior courtyards. And so you approach from the top, and then you move down and into the building. And these are the 6 interior volumes on the left, which alternate with the 4 hourglass-shaped courtyards here. There are essentially 6 rooms that are public, the public program up above, and then you move down to the 2 bedrooms down below. And these are these 6 volumes as they twist in section to allow the courtyards. So the volumes touch only at a corner, but as the courtyards slope in section, it allows you to connect up from one volume to the next. So you get both this alternation between solid and void, but also connectivity within the house itself. This is approaching the house, view of the ocean, and then down into the house. And so This is Maine. This is a cold climate. This is not, a lot of our work is in Los Angeles, where you can have a lot of continuity between inside and out. In Maine, you cannot, but what I think the Courtyards try to do is very much bring the exterior into the heart of the house. And this is a seasonal vacation house, and so the light in the house, I think, would change pretty dramatically from one season to the next, partly through these courtyards. There'd be snow, there'd be leaves, there'd be vegetation sort of in the house itself, because of these courtyards. The 2 bedrooms below are much more embedded in the hillside, and then they have these views up through the courtyard to the sky. Last project is not in the woods in Maine. It's in a very tiny lot in Culver City, in California, in Los Angeles. And this is the lot. It's the second house on a lot. This is happening a lot in LA now, that they've allowed people to build a second house in the backyard, essentially, as a way to make the city denser. A city that's very sparse, not dense at all, is getting a little bit denser because of this. And so the 2 neighbors have already done that. They've already built houses along the alleyway. This is the street here and the existing house. And so what we had was this, when you take setbacks into account, this buildable volume, which was not very large, but also very hemmed in by the buildings on its side. There was very little outdoor space or daylight that gets in past. This is actually the north side, and so your morning and evening light are primarily blocked by the neighboring buildings, except for the center of the site. And so what we did was develop a series of interlocking solid and void interior volumes and exterior spaces that allow slope down to the center to try to allow as much light as possible to get into the house, but then have 3 exterior volumes, 2 of which are kind of entry spaces, and 1 of which is the central courtyard in the house. This is the massing of it in relationship to the existing house. And the plan. So the first floor plan, the living area incorporates the central courtyard. This is all glass, and in fact operable, so the glass folds up. On the second level is you go up the stairs to a guest bedroom and up the stairs to a master bedroom with a balcony overlooking the courtyard. This is a really tiny house. It's about 1,500 square feet. And this is that living volume. So you have a kitchen here, you have living space here, a different kind of living space there, a kind of gallery and workspace here, and then the central courtyard, which is all enclosed in glass, as I said. And so the entire thing is visually continuous, but it's made up of these very different spaces with different ceiling heights, with different materials on the floor or the wall, and then spaces that are inside and outside. So if you think about a mise van der Rohe, a Misesian understanding of continuity between inside and out, it's one of very flowing, uninterrupted space. And this is not that. This is an aggregation of very different spaces that all add up into a visually continuous but very differentiated or discrete set of volumes. Model showing the bedroom, the master bedroom balcony overlooking the courtyard. The client wants everything to be white, but we've convinced him to do 2 walls of color as you go up the stairs into the 2 bedrooms. I think there'll be brighter colors than that. The way in which this space, you slip in through that outdoor space into the house. And then Here's a views of the living room, in this case looking into the courtyard, the master bedroom with the balcony out here. And then this view where you're seeing the very different set of spaces, some of which, again, have very tall ceilings, some of which are low, some of which are outside, some of which are in, but which are visually continuous throughout. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating lecture. Anybody
Thank
have
you.
any questions?